So I'm out in the garage working on this subwoofer box and something seems off. Check out this impedance plot. It looks a little odd. And there are a couple other things about this box that I'm not happy with. Hang tight and I'll show you all that. But first, let's finish the build. Most of the work is done. I'll show you that part in a bit. At this stage, it's time to apply a finish to the box. If you're following along, you're gonna wanna start by hitting that recessed baffle and the port with some spray paint. I'm just using some flat black spray paint that I picked up at the local home center. Here's a bonus tip for you. Go ahead and hit any place where you might have a seam in your carpet or vinyl. That way, if you make a mistake with your upholstery, it'll be easier to hide. This step right here is optional. You can put a round over or a chamfer on the edges. I drug this big heavy box over to the router table and probably shouldn't have done that. It would have been a lot easier to have just grabbed a handheld router, so I'm going to recommend that you do that instead. Most of the box is going to be covered with this stuff right here. This is called Exo Hide. I got it from Parts Express. They also sell a similar product called Duratex. As far as I can tell, the only difference is with Duratex, they throw in the textured roller, and Exo Hide they don't. If you need the roller, get the Duratex. If you have a roller, get the Exo Hide. This is one of the best ways to finish a speaker because it is almost impossible to mess up. The key word being almost. You'll notice some red stuff right here on the box. That is finishing putty. More on that in a bit. The plan here is to cover everything except the baffle with the Exo Hide and then apply carpet or vinyl or something like that to the baffle. If you do this, you want to tape off the baffle. You don't want any Exo Hide on the baffle. Is there anything more satisfying than pulling off masking tape? To apply the vinyl, you'll need to use some type of adhesive. Before you apply that adhesive, you want to tape off anything that you don't want covered with the adhesive. This is supposed to be the best stuff. This is Weldwood Landau top and trim. You can spray it on or brush it on. That is the plan today. Or it was the plan until I hit a snag. I had to stop what I was doing and run out and get a can of spray adhesive. I opted to go with 3M Super 90, which is supposed to be stronger than 3M Super 77. The best advice for working with vinyl is to grab a heat gun. Even if you don't think you need one, grab a heat gun. Notice how when you apply heat, the vinyl just sags right into those woofer cutouts. From there, all you've got to do is apply a little bit of pressure. During the woodworking phase, I cut a round over in that outer baffle. That also makes it a lot easier to wrap the vinyl. A few relief cuts and it's even easier. If you followed my channel at all, you know that I've always struggled to work with vinyl, and every time I do it, I get a little bit better. In the woodworking stage, I did cut rabbets on the underside of that outer baffle and a real small rabbet around the outer edge of the baffle. I'm going to use those cuts as guides to trim the vinyl. Now it's beginning to look like a speaker box, and I'm getting really excited. Let's drop in those subs and do a quick test fit to make sure everything's good. While you're doing that, it's a great time to grab a center punch and mark out some screw holes. You do want to go ahead and pre-drill those holes. The goal here is to wire all four of these subwoofers to a 1 ohm final nominal impedance. They are dual 2 ohm subwoofers, so you're going to start by wiring the voice coils on each driver in series to get a 4 ohm load on each driver. The math for that's not terribly hard to figure out. If you're like me, you're going to end up doing it a lot, and so what I did was just built a spreadsheet to speed things up. If you want a copy of this spreadsheet, check the video description for information. So to wire this up, you need a jumper going from the positive side of one voice coil to the negative side of the other voice coil. You can make those connections with crimp connectors or solder and heat shrink, whatever you want to use. There are pros and cons to both methods. Tell me down in the comments which you prefer and why. In this case, we're mounting to MDF, so I'm going to recommend that you use a coarse threaded wood screw, and of course it's MDF, so you have to drill pilot holes, which I did off camera. It's always a good idea to test and verify, so take a second to verify that everything's wired correctly. All of the subs need to be wired to 4 ohms. The subs are then connected in parallel inside each side of the enclosure, so each side's going to present a 2 ohm load. To get that final 4 ohm load, you just run a jumper from one terminal to the other to parallel the two terminals. Now that the subs are loaded into the enclosure, you're going to see two problems. First, First, the black vinyl looks almost exactly the same as the exo hide. The color and the texture are nearly the same. That's not what I was shooting for. I went with the black vinyl because I had a small piece left over from another project, and it was exactly the size I needed for this piece. That just didn't give the visual impact that I was looking for. You're gonna get a better look if you go with white or gray to get some contrast, or something like blue to match the logo on the Savard wrapped 6.5-inch subwoofers. By the way, if you want to buy some subwoofers from Savard, you can use the discount code down in the video description. Since I'm not happy with the look, I've got to do something to fix it, so I'm going to try this trick right here. One of my viewers shared this idea with me. I've got some blue primary wire. This is leftover turn-on lead from an amp kit. I'm just going to take it and jam it into the seam between the vinyl and the exo hide, and see if I can create like a visual break between the dark sides of the enclosure and the dark front of the enclosure. It looks even worse. That was poorly executed. Here's the second problem. If you rewind back a little bit to this shot right here, you can see that red glazing putty on the enclosure. You can use the glazing putty to fill in divots left by the brad nailer. It's not really necessary, but I wanted to give it a try this time and see what happened. Well, here's what happened. The exo hide just doesn't stick to the glazing putty. It just scratched or flaked right off. And right here you can see some red just poking through the exo hide. That's after 2 coats of exo hide. I'm still a big fan of exo hide. It's still nearly idiot proof, but not 100%. This particular box has turned into a really big learning experience. To verify the tuning frequency, I recommend this right here. This is a DATS. You just use the alligator clips to connect to your terminals and run a sweep. That's how I got this right here. This is the strangest impedance plot I have ever seen. Here's what's going on. Check out these 2 peaks right here in the plot. Normally you expect these 2 peaks to be about the same height. The lower frequency peak is a function of the box tuning, or FB. In this case it's 36 Hertz, and you can find the box tuning at the bottom of that valley. The high frequency peak is a function of the subwoofer's free air resonance, or the FS. When the low frequency peak is shorter than the high frequency peak, that tells us that the box tuning is less than the subwoofer's free air resonance, which is exactly what is going on right here in this design. This is just an extreme example. The FS of the subwoofer is about 50 Hertz, the box is tuned to 36. That's a pretty sizable difference. As best I can tell, this is just a side effect of that extended base shelf design that I used when I tuned the enclosure. An extended base shelf is going to have a very low FB relevant to the FS. So I don't think the plot is telling me that anything is wrong with the enclosure. Hopefully in the future I can build some more boxes and test that hypothesis, but for now we need to see how this box sounds. Let's start with taking some measurements. In the raw data, you can see this peak right here at the tuning frequency, but after you apply some smoothing, that turns into a flat spot. So notice right here how the bass rolls off slowly as the frequency drops. That's not quite what we predicted with WinISD. More on that in just a bit. While we're at it, I'm going to grab the SPL meter and do some in-car testing. For this test, the subs are hooked up to a JP8, and the gain is set with a 0 dB test tone. I'm not pushing these subwoofers as hard as I possibly could because I don't want to destroy the subwoofers. The goal here is to quantify the frequency response, not to win an SPL contest. And the results are interesting. Here's 30 Hertz, 40 Hertz, and 50 Hertz. So the in-vehicle performance is closer to that U-shape prediction that I got in WinISD. Well, how does it sound? My subjective assessment, it's just a little bit boomy. It seems to me to be louder in that 50 to 80 Hertz range, but it does a really great job of hitting the notes the next octave down. That boomy sound's not particularly good for pop, rock, or country, but this build is doing a great job on the bass-heavy electronic music, so it does need some EQ work in order to fine-tune the sound. I was really shocked at how well these little subwoofers could hit those low notes. I've always avoided these small subwoofers because I've always just assumed that they didn't perform well, that they were a bit of a gimmick, and I don't think that's the case. But the box itself looks like it was beat up with an ugly stick, and it's a tad bit overbuilt. To see what I mean by overbuilt, check out this playlist right here. So I'm going to rebuild the box. Before I start rebuilding the box, I want to thank all of my patrons with a bonus shout out to Paul, Jonathan, David, Fargo, JD America, Bo, and Dylan. I'm Justin. This is the DIY Audio Guy YouTube channel, and I will see you on the next adventure.